Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, there are certain times in history when little events turn into big events, or events have a ripple effect, and they end up creating one of the most consequential periods that just impact all of human history. And 1848 is definitely one of those years we have to talk about, especially in European history, when it comes to massive change happening all at once, but also a ripple effect that we see kind of cause ongoing change. So with that in mind, we're going to dive into Epic History TV's video on 1848. This is a 32-minute video, so it'll probably be about an hour-long reaction. That's typically how these go. An event, a series of events that I know some about, but I'm excited to learn more about. So I invite you to add to the conversation. Use the comment section below to let me know something that you learned that you didn't know before, or tell us something that wasn't shared in this video at the end that we can all learn from you, so we can all learn together. Let's go ahead and dive in.
1848. More than 3 decades after his defeat, the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte and the French Revolution still looms over Europe. The peace settlement of 1815 had been a triumph for reactionary forces. Europe's great powers, Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, were committed to working together to ensure no more revolutions.
Now, that's all well and good, right? As long as those 5 nations remain stable, and as long as other nations don't weaken or strengthen. You know, obviously this is a couple of decades before we're going to see the German Empire formed in 1871. Prussia is pretty powerful, but not as powerful as she will be once they gobble up the rest of that. We're going to have wars that are going to happen in the 1860s, 1870. And of course, the Ottoman Empire is weakening. You got Spain just kind of chilling down here, not doing a whole lot. You've got Italy, who hasn't been united yet. All of that is coming, and that's going to shake up all of this. So are internal struggles.
Radicalism and republicanism would not be allowed to disturb the peace of Europe again. Austrian Chancellor Prince Clemens von Metternich is regarded as the architect of this new conservative order. Some historians call it the Metternich system. And yet, across Europe, there are many for whom the ideals of the French Revolution remain not a nightmare, but an inspiration. Liberals seek personal freedoms and civil rights, such as equality before the law, protected by constitutions, a free press, and regular elections. Nationalists share these aims with a desire in Italy and Germany for national unification.
And why is that important? Because look, those are the two, that's the whole central part of Europe, right? This is the former Holy Roman Empire that holds up part of those things, and you got the Papal States down here, which have a lot of territory. But, you know, all these other nations have got significant territories, and then you got all these smaller ones. So it's only natural that they want to get in on the game of having a strong power.
In the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire, for greater recognition, autonomy, and respect for language. Poles continue to seek the restoration of an independent Poland, and have launched one bloody uprising against the Russians in 1830. Their cause is supported by liberals across Europe. In most countries, liberals and nationalists face draconian censorship laws, arrest by the secret police, and bans on political parties and meetings.
All things that we're going to see very prominent in some of those countries in the 20th century as well.
But there are always loopholes. In France, private banquets turn into political rallies. In Italy, scientific societies discuss politics, while gymnastic groups do the same in Germany. These liberal movements are dominated by the middle class, with their own local and national agendas, but also many shared values and aims. They are passionate, organized, and waiting for their opportunity. But it isn't just the middle classes that want change. By 1848, rising populations and food prices had created hunger, poverty, and social unrest across Europe.
So that's important he points that out, because as much as people will want political change because they don't like the system of government, they want to have the right to vote, they want to have more of a say, what typically drives radical change in the end is people's basic needs. Look at the Russian Revolution. Look at the French Revolution. What were those things about? They started from people who were starving, people who were poor, people who were desperate. How did the Nazis rise to power in Germany? People were poor, desperate, oppressed by the financial burden that they were undergoing. That's what drives radical change in the end.
Low wages and hunger drive peasants to cities in increasing numbers, where they become cheap labor to feed the growing pace of industrialization. They live in slums and work long hours in dreadful conditions, if they can find work. Violent protests by workers and peasants are on the rise. Harvest failures and potato blight make a bad situation worse, with a deadly famine in Ireland and food riots across France.
So again, looking at all of these things that are happening, things like this, like the slums and people living in poor conditions, are also happening in places like the United States, in big cities like New York. What's the difference? Well, in the United States, even though it's not everybody yet, a lot of people at least feel like they have a say because they have government that they can vote on. Every 2 years you have congressional elections, every 6 years Senate elections, every 4 years you have presidential elections. Now, not everybody can vote, but at least they feel like they have some control over who's running their government. And a lot of these places, these are monarchies where you don't have that. In Prussia, Austria, Russia, you've got monarchies. In Great Britain, you do have a parliament, but Ireland doesn't have much say in that.
In the face of such crises, Europe's governments offer little support or hope of reform. When French Prime Minister François Guizot is challenged that only the richest 0.5% could vote in France, he merely replies, "Enrichissez-vous, get rich." In the winter of 1840...
That's pretty close to a let them eat cake kind of statement, isn't it? Well, if only the rich people can vote, then go out and get rich. Like that was just easy for people to do.
47-48, a sharp economic downturn throws thousands more out of work. The case for reform is more urgent than ever, but Europe's governments fail to act.
They're getting close to the breaking point.
The stage is set for a European revolution.
So one of the reasons then why 1848 is going to become a year of massive upheaval all across Europe is that all across Europe they're dealing with very similar issues, hunger and financial crisis. So it's not like this is just something where it breaks out one place and everybody else is like, ooh, that's a great idea, let's do this. Well, they were also facing similar reasons for wanting to do that. And so they get inspired. Wow, if it worked there, then maybe we can solve that same crisis we're dealing with here.
In southern Italy, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies is ruled by Spanish Bourbon King Ferdinand II. His disastrous agrarian reforms have united Sicilian landowners and peasants against him. His kingdom will witness 1848's first revolution. In Sicily, furious crowds chase Bourbon troops out of Palermo, and the island declares independence, readopting its liberal constitution of 1812. Revolutionary fervor spreads to the mainland. Mass rallies in Naples force King Ferdinand to issue his own constitution. In Piedmont, Sardinia, the threat of revolution persuades King Carlo Alberto to grant a constitution, and there are celebrations in the streets of Turin. Across the border in Austrian-ruled Lombardy-Venetia, Italian nationalists revolt in Milan and Venice. and drive out the Austrian garrisons. But as dramatic as these events are, they're about to be eclipsed by news from Paris.
That is such a powerful statement right there. Who said that? Metternich. Yeah, so when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold, right? So whatever happens in France affects everybody else. Why? France has traditionally been one of the great powers on the mainland of Europe, and that's just not during Napoleon's time. That goes back much before that as well. But look at what happened when France has a revolution, right? Napoleon rises to power, and that sends the whole continent into war for a couple of decades.
Since France's 1830 July Revolution, the country has been ruled by Louis Philippe, the so-called citizen king. He's a more moderate figure than his Bourbon predecessor, Charles X, but he opposes further reform, despite the growing economic crisis. His Prime Minister, François Guizot, is hated. When he bans the banquets that are really opposition rallies, angry crowds march through Paris, chanting, "Down with Guizot, long live reform." Guizot resigns, but it is not enough. Nervous troops fire on the crowds. 52 civilians are killed. Louis Philippe loses control of the capital, and as the mob advances on the Tuileries Palace, he abdicates and flees to England.
Think about how often France has seen this kind of upheaval for going on a century at this point, right? They have the French Revolution, late 1780s, early 1790s. They have the Terror and all that. Then you go right into the Napoleonic period, 1790s, first decade of the 1800s. And then the second decade of the 1800s, now you see Napoleon overthrown. In the middle of that decade, you have the restoration of the monarchy. Another 15 years goes by, and you have some uprisings that happen in the 1830s, but the monarchy hangs on to things. And now in the 1840s, you have the monarchy overthrown again. They really have not known a generation of peace.
A new provisional government is formed. And from the Hôtel de Ville, new Foreign Minister Alphonse de Lamartine announces, "The Republic has been proclaimed." France's monarchy has fallen in just 3 days. The news is carried across Europe by the new telegraph system. The effect is electrifying.
So Ferdinand I of Austria is such an interesting character, and if you look at images of him, paintings, things like that, you see this large head that he has. He had like hydrocephalus, right? His parents were double first cousins to each other, which means they were genetically siblings. Double first cousins, that's like if me and my sister married a brother and sister to each other, right? Or not to each other. So say my sister marries a guy, and then I marry that guy's sister, right? And then our children, the child that I have with my spouse and the child my sister has with her spouse, who is actually my wife's brother, our kids marry each other. That's what double first cousins are. That's the kind of thing we're dealing with here. So taking inbreeding to a whole new level. And so he's really not in a position to exercise a great deal of authority on his own, and he's going to end up overthrown by the end of the year. But when he became the Emperor of Austria, there were certain rules that were put into place because of his special circumstances.
75-year-old Austrian Chancellor Prince Metternich is among the first to be informed of the revolution in Paris. His police chief assures him there's no chance of such a thing happening in Vienna. But on the 13th of March, around 4,000 students, inspired by the news from Paris, march on the Landhaus, the assembly building, and force their way in. There's a confrontation with troops who open fire and kill 4. Vienna's workers side with the students. Much of the crowd's hostility is directed at Metternich. When the State Council suggests he resign, Metternich meekly agrees and heads into exile in England.
Everybody goes to England when they go into exile.
One of the most extraordinary political careers in Europe's history, spanning 40 years, comes to an end. Emperor Ferdinand suffers from epilepsy and a speech impediment, and is a largely passive figure. But when his council announces there will be elections for an assembly that will draft a constitution, crowds cheer him in the street. The secret police disappear. Censorship is ignored. The people of Vienna celebrate.
I wanted to switch over real quick and show you, because Ferdinand's going to live to the 1870s. This is a photo taken of him. You can see his head. You can see the obvious birth defects that the man had, and in addition to the other things that they just mentioned, the epilepsy and the speech impediment. Just not a guy who ever really had any business being on the throne. Not his fault. I mean, he's the product of what happens when you have inbreeding in the Habsburg family for generations.
Nationalists within the Austrian Empire are also inspired by events. In the Hungarian parliament, politician Lajos Kossuth makes a fiery speech denouncing Habsburg absolutism as the pestilential air which dulls our nerves and paralyzes our spirit.
That's hardcore.
His speech is printed and circulated widely, inspiring others across the empire. Hungarians launched their own revolution, with 12 demands that include greater autonomy, a free press, and parliamentary reform. Czech liberals in Prague form a national committee and also send their demands to Vienna. There is even a Romanian nationalist uprising in the Ottoman province of Wallachia, forcing the abdication of the local prince.
Wallachia, that's where Dracula's from, right? I mean, this is modern-day Romania, right? Transylvania is still part of the Austrian Empire at this point, but Romania is all of this now.
Across the smaller states of Germany.
I wonder if that's the same Karl Schurz that will go on to be a general in the American Civil War. Interesting. It's cool, though, to see that people recognized that as this stuff was breaking out, that there would be a ripple effect in the rest of Europe.
Rulers face popular demands for reform. Most quickly grant concessions to avoid losing their thrones. The black, red and gold tricolour, symbol of a united Germany, is prominent among the crowds. Germany's first ever National Assembly meets in Frankfurt, with elected delegates from across Germany. They debate how they will achieve the liberal dream of a unified Germany, and begin drafting its national constitution. In the Prussian capital, Berlin, students and liberals are thrilled by developments and celebrate Metternich's fall. King Frederick William IV promises reform, but also moves extra troops into the city.
And all of this is going to have a ripple effect in that there's a group of people known as, I think they're called 48ers. They're going to be millions of ethnic Germans who are going to emigrate to the United States during this time. And a lot of them are going to end up being involved in the American Civil War. And it's not just Germany. This happens from other places as well. But I just know in particular there's a huge wave of German immigration to the United States from all of this.
Tensions escalate between Berliners and soldiers. And on the 18th of March, protesters erect barricades. The army attacks, leading to vicious fighting in the streets. 800 protesters are killed. The king loses his stomach for the slaughter and withdraws troops from the city, promising a new constitution.
So, saddle your horses, gentlemen. A republic has been declared in France. And again, so Nicholas understands, Nicholas I does, the ripple effect of all of this. It's interesting to note, though, how many of these so far have happened quickly with very little resistance. It's almost like these monarchs understood there was going to be no stopping this, and that they were better off agreeing to it than putting up a bloody struggle that was going to kill tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands and then end up with the same result anyway.
Not all Europe is embracing change. In Russia, Emperor Nicholas firmly opposes any reforms. He'd been badly shaken by the Decembrist revolt on the opening day of his reign. Since then, he has tightened censorship and created a new secret police unit, the Third Department. There is a crackdown on all suspected subversives. Writer Fyodor Dostoevsky is among those arrested and subjected to a mock execution before he is exiled to Siberia. There will be no concessions in Russia. By European standards, Britain is already a liberal constitutional monarchy, and the middle classes broadly accept the status quo. But there is a popular movement calling for more democratic reforms. They're known as the Chartists.
So vote for all men over 21, secret ballots, which you don't have. And a lot of people don't realize this, that voting didn't necessarily happen the way it does today in a lot of places, even here in the U.S. It was very public how you voted, and there were different boxes depending on which candidate you were voting for or which party you were supporting. So secret ballots weren't necessarily a given at this time. No property qualification for MPs, members of parliament. Payment of MPs, equal constituencies in annual parliaments. Interesting stuff.
For the 6-point charter they wish to implement. A mass rally is organised for the 10th of April in London. This is a photograph of that meeting. The authorities fear violence and draft in 80,000 extra police. But the event passes off peacefully. In the Netherlands, King William II backs a new constitution and reforms, successfully preempting any revolutionary disturbance.
Nicely done.
With fortuitous timing, Frederick VII of Denmark had abolished royal absolutism in January, so also avoids revolution. But he faces a German nationalist revolt in Schleswig-Holstein,
and you're going to have war, right, between Germany and Denmark over Schleswig-Holstein coming very soon.
Leads to war with the German Confederation. Denmark will ultimately prevail in this war thanks to diplomatic support from the other European powers. In 1848, Polish hopes were high that these revolutions would pave the way for the restoration of an independent Poland. Europe's liberals, after all, had frequently expressed enthusiasm for the idea. But in reality, no major power is willing to risk confrontation with Russia for the sake of the Poles.
Sorry, Poland.
A Polish rising in Posen is put down by the Prussians, while the Austrians deal with risings in Krakow and Galicia.
The February Revolution was like a sacred promise of emancipation for all the peoples of Europe. That's, again, pretty powerful. New Paris prefect of police. Interesting.
The first euphoric phase of the European revolutions becomes known as the springtime of the peoples. With censorship relaxed, there's an explosion in the number of newspapers, among them Cologne's radical new daily, Neue Rheinische Zeitung, edited by Karl Marx. It feels like the dawn of a new era. But these early successes are built on the back of an uneasy alliance.
You know where Karl Marx is buried? He's buried in London, I think in Highgate Cemetery. Another guy who got exiled to England.
As Marx is quick to highlight. Middle-class liberals want constitutions, more inclusion in politics, and a free press. Workers, who are the revolutionary foot soldiers in many cities, want cheaper food and the right to work. German radicals sum it up with a neat pun: freedom to read versus freedom to feed. Europe's new assemblies are under pressure from conservatives who think they're going too far, and radicals and socialists who think they're not going far enough.
Isn't that always the struggle? Everybody agrees that something needs to change, but they don't agree on what it should change to. And they're going to have to find common ground, or they're just going to end up fighting each other. That's what happens in Russia and their revolution. Everybody agrees there should be a revolution, but what should it look like afterwards? France, right? You have the very extreme people who are going to commit the terror, but then you have the folks who are a little more level-headed. That always seems to be the case.
Most horrifying of all to Europe's middle class, there hovers the threat of mass, direct action, social revolution, the mob.
Bread or lead, bread or lead. Wow. It's hardcore.
In the wake of the revolution, France's provisional government had set up national workshops, a public works programme to alleviate unemployment in Paris. But just 3 months later, a new, more conservative government announces their closure. 100,000 workers are suddenly jobless.
That's bad.
The response is immediate and furious.
What did they think would happen when it's already a delicate situation? It's already the fear of uprising is there, and then you suddenly put 100,000 people out of work. What did you think they were going to do?
Over 3 days in June, Paris radicals take on the middle-class National Guard and regular troops in a bloody battle of the barricades. The Archbishop of Paris attempts to mediate, but is cut down in a crossfire.
I was going to say, there are actually photographs of these barricades that we can see today, and it's really fascinating to see some of these things, because the 1840s, photography is now a thing, right? So we're going to get actual photographs of the people and places involved in all of this.
Remarkable early photograph shows some of the Paris barricades fought over that summer.
Wow.
By the time it's all over, General Cavaignac's troops have killed at least 1,500 workers and arrest 12,000 more, a third of whom are deported to Algeria. He believes he has saved France from anarchy.
Deported out. They take them to Africa. Leave them there.
The sacred cause of the Republic has triumphed, he declares.
Remember, this is a brand new republic, right? The king has just stepped down. The republic's only a couple of months old, and now they're having to put down their own rebellions.
The French Revolution has split between left and right, with bloody consequences. It paves the way for the return of a famous name from the past,
Napoleon,
promising unity and order.
"3 days of blood will give us 30 years of peace." Not quite.
That spring, conservative governments had been caught off guard by the speed of events. Now they begin to fight back. In Prague, Czech students clash with troops. The wife of Austrian commander General Windisch-Graetz is killed by a stray bullet.
Oh, wow.
He responds by withdrawing his troops and bombarding the city's old town with artillery. 43 are killed before the students surrender. In Italy, King Carlo Alberto of Piedmont, Sardinia, has declared an Italian war of liberation against Austria and invades Lombardy Venetia. He is supported by the other Italian states and nationalist volunteers, including the Italian Legion, led by professional revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi.
So, what better way to unite the Italian people than a war, right? Let's focus on an external enemy and unite behind this cause. Because Piedmont, Sardinia is not going to go to war with the Austrians by himself without help from others. And it also helps that Austria is dealing with its own internal things, and so maybe they're a little distracted.
Austrian forces in Italy are commanded by 81-year-old Field Marshal Radetzky,
81.
a distinguished veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. Vienna orders him to negotiate. Instead, Radetzky wages a masterful campaign, fending off the Piedmontese advance, then launching a decisive counterattack.
We want you to negotiate. How about I don't and I just win the war?
Piedmontese forces retreat in disarray, Carlo Alberto negotiates a truce. That summer, Johann Strauss composes the Radetzky March to celebrate the old general's victory. Meanwhile, Austrian relations with Hungary are in crisis. The country is now effectively independent, with its own elected parliament and a prime minister, Lajos Batthyány. But not everyone wants to be part of the new Hungary. Savage ethnic conflicts break out between Hungarians and Romanians in Transylvania and Hungarians and Serbs in Vojvodina, leaving thousands dead. An even greater threat is Croatian General Josip Jelačić, a fire-breathing imperial loyalist who takes matters into his own hands and invades what he regards as a renegade province.
What is it? Look at how nobody is paying attention to what the empire is telling them to do, right? You got these rogue generals just doing what they want in Austria right now. This shows you how weak the head of the government is to even really have control over things. Plus, you're dealing with all of these multi-ethnic and multiple religions and multiple languages and cultures.
The emperor still hopes for a peaceful resolution and sends a loyal general, Count Lamberg, to take command of Hungarian military forces. But on arrival, he's brutally murdered by a mob.
Wow.
Appalled, the imperial government declares war on the Hungarian revolutionaries. This in turn outrages liberals and radicals in Vienna. There is fresh violence on the streets, and the Austrian Minister of War is lynched. Troops evacuate the city, while the emperor flees to Olmütz. Jelačić marches to the government's aid. He joins forces with Windisch Graetz outside Vienna, and together they bombard the city. Then they attack. The October Rising is crushed, with the loss of 2,000 lives.
It's crazy. You got a Croatian general loyal to the Austrian crown invading Vienna. Fascinating stuff.
25 revolutionary leaders are executed, including Robert Blum, a member of the German parliament in Frankfurt. He becomes a celebrated martyr of the revolutions. With Vienna secure, the Austrian invasion of Hungary can begin. The Hungarians are heavily outnumbered. Budapest falls, and the Hungarian government evacuates to Debrecen.
Major Helmuth von Moltke. That is a name that is going to be so important later on. And then, of course, I think it's his nephew who will be the initial German commander in World War I. But this is a name that is, at this time, he's only a major. But we have 40,000 men in and around Berlin. Order in Berlin, and we shall have order in the country.
Following the violence in Berlin that March, the King of Prussia withdraws to his palace at Potsdam, on the outskirts of the city. Here he is surrounded by loyal troops and conservative advisors, including a 33-year-old aristocrat named Otto von Bismarck.
More from him later.
When asked for his view on what should be done, Bismarck says nothing, but leans over to a piano and taps out the March of the Prussian Infantry. The forces of conservatism are strong in Prussia. There is deep loyalty to the state and the king. Allies, like Bismarck, adopt the enemy's tactics, launching conservative political organizations and newspapers to mobilize this support.
Smart.
By November, King Frederick William has noted the infighting of his opponents and the defeat of the Vienna Revolution, and decides to act. He orders General Wrangel to lead 13,000 troops into Berlin. They enter the city unopposed and order the Prussian assembly to disperse. it has no option but to comply. Prussia will get its constitution, but it is one handed down by the king, under which he retains full executive power.
And why is that possible? Because he wasn't under duress. He was proactive in bringing the troops in before a revolution erupts in his city. And then while he's still got the upper hand and while he's speaking from a position of strength, he imposes the Constitution and kind of takes the rug out from the possibility of an uprising.
Prussian dreams of a true parliamentary system, even a republic, are dashed. In December, 2 new players take the stage, who will play key roles in shaping the fate of Europe's revolutions. In Vienna, Emperor Ferdinand abdicates in favor of his 18-year-old nephew, Franz Josef.
Same Franz Josef who's going to still be the emperor when World War I breaks out in 1914. He'll die in 1916. Think about what this man is going to see during his reign. It's incredible.
He will reign until his death in 1916. In Paris, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of Emperor Napoleon, is elected President of the French Republic in a landslide victory.
When France has a revolution, who do they turn to? The Bonapartes. It happened again. And this is the same Louis Napoleon who's going to become Napoleon III, who will turn his presidency into into becoming an emperor. But that'll all fall apart in the Franco-Prussian War.
He promises to heal divisions, impose order, and restore France to her former glory.
Back to Italy.
In Italy, the tumult continues into 1849. In the Papal States, the reforms of Pope Pius had seen him held up as an unlikely liberal role model. But escalating radicalism and violence, notably the assassination of his justice minister, Pellegrino Rossi, caused Pope Pius to flee Rome.
Wow.
In his absence, a Roman Republic is declared. It is led by Giuseppe Mazzini, the iconic figurehead of Italian nationalism, who's devoted his life to the unification of his homeland. But elsewhere, the Italian cause fares badly. Carlo Alberto resumes his war with Austria, with disastrous consequences. At the Battle of Novara, Radetzky inflicts another heavy defeat.
And at this point, Austria is now led by a much more competent emperor. He's young, yes, he's only a teenager still, but he's much more competent, and the situation in Austria is much more stable. So I'm not really sure what Carlo Alberto thought was going to happen.
Carlo Alberto abdicates in favor of his son, Vittorio Emanuele, to avoid a republican revolution. 12 years later, he'll become the first king of a modern united Italy.
Victor Emmanuel.
In the south, Ferdinand reverts to absolutist rule and sends troops to Sicily who stamp out the revolution. Then, to the dismay of liberals across Europe, French President Louis Napoleon sends troops to crush the Republic of Rome and put the Pope back on his throne. He has decided the support of French Catholics is more important to him than the fate of Italian republicans. French forces are led by General Oudinot, son of the famous Marshal.
Look at these names coming back up. Napoleon rules France. General Oudinot is going to march into Italy.
Defenders are led by Garibaldi. But despite skilled and courageous resistance, Rome is forced to surrender after a 2-month siege. That summer, Radetzky also retakes Venice and puts an end to its republic. In March, the German National Parliament in Frankfurt had finally agreed on a constitution for a united Germany. It is to be a constitutional monarchy under an emperor. The man intended to play this role is Frederick William of Prussia. So when he declines the offer, the plan is killed stone dead. In public, he says it is impossible without the consent of the other German princes. In private, he says he would never accept a crown from the gutter, disgraced by the stink of revolution.
Wow. So what this is really about is not that he wouldn't want to be an emperor of a united Germany, because he absolutely would. He doesn't want it under those circumstances. He doesn't want it to be a constitutional monarchy. He wants it to be something where he's going to have all the authority he has in Prussia, but on a pan-German scale.
Revolts in support of the national constitution break out in Saxony, the Palatinate, and the Grand Duchy of Baden. They are crushed by local forces, assisted by Prussian troops. The Frankfurt Parliament itself is dissolved. What hope there had been for a united Germany under a liberal constitution lies in ruins. In Austria, the new Emperor Franz Joseph issues his own new constitution, reclaiming almost all political power.
Look at that baby face.
He also revokes all the liberal reforms passed by the Hungarian parliament, known as the April Laws.
So what all did he revoke there? Freedom of the press, equality before the law, annual parliaments, ministers accountable to parliament, abolition of serfdom, freeing of political prisoners, creation of a national guard. All gone. Wow.
Reforms passed by the Hungarian parliament, known as the April Laws. In response, Lajos Kossuth declares formal Hungarian independence, and the country begins an extraordinary campaign of military mobilization. Hungarian commander General Gergely retakes Budapest. He then launches a bloody assault on Buda Castle, overpowering its Austrian garrison. In desperation, the Austrian emperor travels to Warsaw to formally request military aid from the Emperor of Russia. Russian troops have already moved into Moldavia and then Wallachia to put down the Romanian liberal revolution. Nicholas now agrees to send troops to Hungary to crush those he describes as the enemies of order and tranquility.
Interesting, the Russians are going to help the Austrian emperor to solidify his hold on the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's what it'll become. Only for them to turn around and fight it out a couple generations later.
Hungary faces an impossible strategic situation, surrounded and outnumbered more than 2-1. The combined onslaught is irresistible. The Hungarian forces are driven south and finally forced to surrender. In the aftermath, around 120 Hungarian politicians and army officers are executed. So ends Hungary's War of Independence.
And socialism is going to remain pretty strong in France and continue to be a thorn in the side of the ruling governments.
1848 was a year like no other. A series of seismic political events following one upon another like falling dominoes. But what had been achieved? A British historian famously described 1848 as the turning point at which modern history failed to turn. And for all the euphoria of Europe's springtime of the peoples, by 1849, it seemed that the counter-revolutionaries had won everywhere. But some gains did endure, such as the abolition of serfdom in Austria and the popular vote in France, though France became a little less democratic in 1852, after Louis Napoleon made himself emperor. Across Europe, governments modernized and paid more attention to economic and social issues, partly in response to the new challenges that had emerged from socialist and working-class politics. The causes of German and Italian unification had been defeated, but made giant strides and learned crucial lessons.
And they're going to become inevitable. And so the seeds are planted in 1848 that sometimes don't see their growth and their production of fruit for another decade or two. But, 1850s, 1860s, up to 1870 are going to be incredibly important times for that central part of Europe that are going to define the next few generations and become the build-up then to the First World War.
Their goals would not be achieved by ideas alone, but the realities of force. In the words of Bismarck, the great questions of the day were to be settled not through speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood.
There's that speech.
It would.
And if you have not seen the Extra History series on Bismarck, I'll put a link in the description and up at the end of the video to my reaction to that. Fantastic. One of the most important figures of the last 200 years in world history.
Wars waged by powerful monarchies that united Germany and Italy. The legacy of 1848, for good and ill, would be felt for decades to come.
Good stuff. Epic History TV always does a fantastic job, so I highly recommend you check out their channel if you haven't already and see a lot of the great stuff they've done. I've done a few other reactions to their stuff over time, including their Napoleonic War series, which is fantastic. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Check out some of these other videos that I'll put up on the screen if you want to learn more, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.